Good morning. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about two of my favorite things, space and food. And so I actually feel like now I should have an elephant on my slide somewhere. So I do want to start by saying the speaker after me, Dr. Scott Smith, he comes up with the requirements. He does a lot of research to come up with the nutritional requirements that end up being part of our food system. So we need to meet those nutritional requirements. And there are three really key parts of a food system for spaceflight. We're providing all of the foods, so we need to make sure that entire system is safe, acceptable, and nutritious. And then we also need to make sure it's promoting crew health. And then alternative to these, and almost in contrast, we have to always fit within the box. So there's very, very, very tight resource constraints on every space vehicle. And so there are actually quite a few challenges on a lot of these space vehicles. This is a closed system. We can't routinely introduce new foods. We need shelf stability for multiple years. And we don't have cold storage on most of these vehicles. So everything's just held at room temperature. They can't cook. We can't send stuff that has a lot of crumbs or free liquid. They can't really transfer food easily in space flights. And they don't have a lot of time for preparation. So everything's pretty much heat and add water. They are very busy, usually with experiments on the International Space Station. And when we start going to the lunar surface and to Mars, we expect them to be very busy out on the surface doing extravehicular activities or spacewalks. So they're also very restricted in resources, even as important as water. Right now they only get about 2.5 liters of water per day per person for food and drinking purposes. So in the past, NASA started to solve these problems by just using tubes and cubes on Mercury. So you've probably seen the tubes and cubes. They would just, the tubes were coated, or the cubes were coated in gelatin, so there wouldn't be any crumbs. They just pop them in their mouth, and the tubes, they just squeeze in their mouths. This is not a very acceptable system. So a lot of these were more, for show, and a lot of the food came back with the crew. They didn't consume it all. In Gemini, they got a little bit better. They had a water gun. They were able to add water to some foods, but then they would just cut it open and squeeze it into their mouths. And they didn't have hot water. So still not very acceptable. A lot of these foods came back, and there were crew that lost quite a bit of weight, even on the Gemini missions. Apollo got a little bit better. They started sending some canned foods, and they were able to finally add hot water, which they said was very critical. And they started eating with utensils. We found that if we could get a good surface tension in the food would stay in the package or on the utensil while they were eating, especially if they were eating slowly enough. So however, they were still losing quite a bit of weight on Apollo. So when we went to Skylab, this was the best food system ever because they had refrigerators and they had freezers, and this was the only time that this was available in a space vehicle. So the foods were generally pretty high quality. The crews ate more, but they also commented it took a long time to heat the foods up because they were frozen. They don't have a microwave on orbit. They use conduction heating. And they found that when they were very busy on the Skylab, that they didn't always have time to heat the foods up and to eat together as a crew because of that. So that is a problem. We want our crew to be able to eat together. There are a lot of benefits when you're far away, when you're on a space mission, to being able to have that time with your crew for crew cohesion and just better morale. So when we went to shuttle, we actually had to reduce the mass and the volume of the food system again. We had larger crews on a relatively small vehicle for sometimes 9 people. So we went to all flexible packaging, and it was still heat or add water. And we continued to use this system when we went to the International Space Station missions. But now instead of the 2-week shuttle missions, we were going towards 6-month International Space Station missions. And they had about 130 food options on the shuttle. And that sounds like a lot, but if you even just walk into a grocery store before you even leave the doorway, you're probably looking at more than 130 options. So it's not very much. They also, on shuttle, were launched with their food, so they could have some selection in the food that went with them. And on the International Space Station, the food gets resupplied, and the vehicles don't always launch on the date that they originally intend them to. So the crews were getting somebody else's food sometimes because the resupply didn't coincide with their mission. So we're seeing more body mass loss on the International Space Station missions, up to even 10%. And body mass loss in high-performing, very healthy people who are in microgravity equates to significant bone and muscle loss, cardio deconditioning, and so this was a problem. We did switch from a preference to a standard menu for the International Space Station in 2008, and what this meant was we did not give, they got much more limited amounts of foods that they specifically chose. Most of their foods come from 8 standard categories that are listed here, and they have a lot of variety within those categories. It works great if everybody wants something different. It works less great if everyone wants the same thing, because if you really like something, it might show up twice or 3 times in 7 to 9 days, and if everyone on your crew likes it, because right now we have 3 people eating out of that set of containers, you might not see it at all, unless you send it in the small amount of preference containers that they currently do still get. And the other change that we made was we increased the variety on the menu, so we have about 200, a little over 200 different items now, and that includes beverages. And we did reduce sodium a number of years ago, so it was around 4,500 milligrams. Now we're closer to 3,000 milligrams a day for our menu. These are all processed foods, and salt provides a lot of flavor. It actually also helps with the freeze-dried foods. It helps them rehydrate. So there are numerous reasons why salt really helps with these foods. But Dr. Scott Smith found that crew who exercised and ate enough food and maintained their vitamin D status could maintain their bone and muscle. So this was very important, especially as we go on to long duration missions, to know that if we can encourage them to eat, if we can give them a food system they want to eat, then they can maintain their bone and muscle. So the International Space Station has taught us a lot about the human. And we see that on the International Space Station there are changes in the immune system. There's been significant immune dysregulation that has been measured, reduction in immune cell function. They do lose body mass and muscle mass. And as we go further into space and the missions get longer, the medical capability is actually going to reduce. So we know that food's going to be on every single human mission. It has to be. So the best way we can look at it is how can food help prevent some of the negative health effects? And so we look at diet as a countermeasure. It's almost a first-line defense against anything that can happen to the human body in spaceflight. If you're maintaining your nutrition, you're maintaining your intake, and we know that we can work on this significantly on Earth to try and provide them the best system and one that they want to eat for these amounts of time. So diet is basically interacting with everything. Our microbiomes are eating what we're eating, producing thousands of other metabolites. We don't even know what they all are. And there's a complex interaction with pretty much every system in our bodies, our immune system, our brain through the gut-brain axis. And so we really want to be able to provide our crews within all of these limitations the best system we can, because they are very high-performing people. They have to be high-performing through very long missions. And so food is key to the mission success. As we go towards exploration, our constraints actually become greater, though. So we're looking at now up to 3-year missions in segments of microgravity and reduced gravity on planetary surfaces. Still likely no refrigeration. There's a huge resource use that refrigeration would require, and so that's why it's not really been on most of the vehicles to date. To launch these systems and to have them work and not break and have this parts you would need to fix them gets very complicated. But when we go to Mars, we won't even be able to resupply the crew. So on the International Space Station right now, they get resupplied relatively regularly. Once they go to Mars, there's going to be no resupply because Mars keeps getting further away from us. So we have very few windows to launch, and then as Mars gets closer again, to bring the crew back. So we have to likely send the food ahead of the crew because it's very mass heavy, and make sure it gets there, which means all of the food would need to have at least a 5-year shelf life, possibly with no refrigeration. So there are a lot of challenges here. We're not going to really be able to provide any fresh food. It basically is going to, instead of look like what's on the left, it's going to look like what's on the right. It's more of a sterile system than humans on Earth are dealing with. And it's very unique because there's no food system in history that needed to support people over a 5-year shelf life. And if we look at the age of sale, where there was a lot of nutritional issues, and nutrition and food was one of the #1 reasons for failures and deaths, they were only out for a couple months at a time. It wasn't very long. So when we talk about our crews going to Mars and being gone for 3 years, this is much longer. If we look at polar exploration, they would actually be out for 2 years, maybe even 3 years. But once again, the food system was a major reason for human loss, a major reason for mission failure, if they didn't plan well, if they were missing any nutrients. And they actually had the capability to freeze food because they were in the Arctic or the Antarctic, and they could hunt. So unless we find something to hunt on Mars, we're not really going to be able to do what they did in polar exploration. So if we look at the modern U.S. military, they actually limit MRE use to 21 days. They've done quite a few studies and found that they do eat less on MREs, so the warfighters will eat less on MREs, and over time, that starts impacting their performance. It can start impacting their health. And if you want a high-performing military, you feed them to be high-performing. And of course, we do want a high-performing group of astronauts who can succeed in their mission, and we want to be able to support them to succeed in their mission. But our challenge is we have to provide our crews these prepackaged systems for much longer amounts of time and keep them eating. It's not a choice, because in the military, they can still fly out fresher foods. They can still bring the warfighters back and cook for them. So if we look at our prepackaged food system, we know right now that it cannot meet a 5-year shelf life, and we know that there are several other constraints, such as volume. So the nutrients degrade in it, the quality degrades, it doesn't taste as good after 5 years, and there's no customization. So if we look at even vitamin C, so scurvy is one of the #1 causes of death in exploration, in the history of exploration, we see that it degrades significantly in our foods. And a lot of these are actually fortified. So these are just our fruit products, with the blue bar being initial vitamin C content right after these products were produced. The red bar is a year after they were produced, and the black bar is 3 years after they were produced. So this doesn't even go to 5 years. But we lose most of our vitamin C. So we get the question, why not use a supplement? So we could use supplements for some things that we're very concerned about, like vitamin C. You could provide some supplementation, but in general, the nutrients degrade in the supplements too, and we want them to eat calories, which we're not going to provide that in a supplement. So quality and nutrition tend to degrade together, and so we want to make sure that our food system has the quality that keeps the crew eating, and therefore it should have the nutrients as well, so that they're getting their calories and they're getting their nutrients. And on top of that, there are thousands of bioactive compounds in fresh fruits and vegetables that we're probably not going to be able to provide in a supplement. We don't even know what they all are. So if we're looking at functional foods and how to provide them for space flights, we're definitely going to have to be providing real foods in this area. We know that these foods can provide all kinds of benefits, from improved nutritional and bone health to reduced inflammation and oxidative status. So they're helping with the immune system, they're helping with the microbiota diversity, and all the other impacts that I mentioned at the beginning that whole fruits and vegetables can provide. We can't supplement this with a pill. And we do know that some of these bioactive compounds are still degrading in our food. So this is just anthocyanin stability in cherry blueberry cobbler. And the very first diamond is the initial concentration. And if we hold it at hotter temperatures, so room temperature or heat abuse temperature, which could happen on these missions, we lose quite a bit even within 1 year. If we have refrigeration, we can provide some protection. So the last box is 4 degrees at 6 months and a year. But once again, we don't know how much refrigeration or if any we're going to be able to have, because that's still a challenge on the engineering side. And then finally, acceptability and variety. So a lot of people ask the question, why can't we just give them a meal and a pill, or why can't we just give them food bars? So the astronauts should be able to eat anything. But the truth is that astronauts, just like us, want to eat what they want to eat. And if you're not giving them what they want to eat or what they enjoy, they eat less. So they're still going to eat something, but they're not going to eat enough to maintain their body mass, their bone mass, their muscle mass, and it can start having more and more impacts over time, and this could actually end up going downhill pretty quickly. So we know that with our thermostabilized or our canned foods, which are basically pouched, similar to the military, after 5 years, we only expect about 7 of those to still still taste good. So in a system that starts with 65. So that is a huge problem if we want to keep our crew's interest in these foods. Now, this was without refrigeration, so there's still a chance. When we do a lot of our studies, if we can show that refrigeration could get us to 5 years, well, that shows the risk of not having it. So this is the risk of not having it right now. And then finally, we have our resource challenge. So on the upcoming Orion missions, which are scheduled to fly in the next few years, we're challenged to reduce the mass by 10%. The total mass from our scenario is actually over 10,000 kilograms with our current food system. And every mass reduction strategy we put into place has to consider long-term acceptability and nutrition. And I will actually talk a little bit more about that. So we are looking at multiple solutions. We don't eat one way here on Earth. We don't eat just from prepackaged foods or just from plants, fresh foods that we get in the grocery store. We eat a combination. We cook, we eat prepackaged foods. And so we are looking at this system as it's likely to be a combination too. There'll be prepackaged foods. Hopefully they'll be able to grow some foods. And then the third one would be some sort of automated nutrition. And this could be something like a 3D printer, something that can provide personalized nutrition. And I will talk more about that as well. So prepackaged food, there's a case to be made for it. We confirm the safety prior to launch. It doesn't need a lot of infrastructure. It's just heat and add water. And there's no risk of food scarcity. It has already demonstrated the ability to support human health on 6 to 12-month missions. However, those missions are resupplied regularly. So we're looking at how can we achieve a 5-year shelf life with these foods, and this is likely to be a combination of methods. So how can we improve formulas? How can we improve processing? There's new processes out there like microwave-assisted thermosterilization. What can that buy us? Especially if you start combining it with other things, like combine that with a better package, the best that you can get, and then a cold storage environment. Can you get that 5-year shelf life? So that's one of the strategies. And then for functional foods, one of the things we've been working on is adding more functional foods to the crew diet so that they have more choice in fruits and vegetables than they have had previously. And so this is an example of some of the foods that we've developed recently, and you can see some of them on the right. So they are still all prepackaged. This shows 2 freeze-dried foods. That's a mango salad and a fish product with some salsa. And then those are beets. Those are red beets. So we're trying to provide these in a way that our crews can get all this variety on orbit. So finally, the biggest challenge is probably the resource reduction because every vehicle wants us to reduce our mass. An immediate strategy for that would be meal replacement and with something very dense. It's not a very acceptable system, and I can mention that a little bit more later too. Other potential strategies would be to work on our packaging designs. Increasing fat content comes up a lot. However, we are at the limit of our saturated fat. We're not at the limit of our unsaturated fat, but unsaturated fat's also more unstable. So can we get to 5 years if we start increasing the unsaturated fat? That's a huge challenge because we still need to make sure it's acceptable. So there's also a case for growing foods in flight. They provide great psychological appeal, something that is reminiscent of Earth, variety and customization, and it also leads us to the mission goal of mission self-reliance. So if we're going to move off this planet and start colonizing and move further into deep space, we need to be able to grow our own food. We need to be able to produce our own food. So we need to start building those systems now and understanding how they work. And there's a lot of this work is getting done at the Kennedy Space Center. So if we look at, this is the veggie. Some of you might have seen it. They've been growing crops in it on the International Space Station for the last few years. It's basically just been lettuce. And so the crews, though, even though they've only been able to grow some lettuce and it's only been periodic, just by the number of pictures that they post from the little bit of lettuce that they have shows how important this can be psychologically when you're basically in a sterile environment. You're basically up there. You're in outside a mechanical vehicle the entire time for 6 months, for a year, for longer when we go to Mars, this really just shows how growing something can really help psychologically too. But we are at a low technology readiness for plant growth at this point, and so that does provides a risk of food scarcity. So this is 6 flowers that they were actually growing, and 2 of them didn't grow at all. So Scott Kelly was actually so happy that he got that last one to grow. He spent a lot of time taking care of it, that if you can look online and there's pictures of him holding this flower like everywhere on the International Space Station, and apparently he brought it home with him. So, this does show that the huge challenge, this was a watering challenge in spaceflight, but if we don't start moving in this direction, if we don't start figuring out how to make this work, then we're not ever going to get to mission self-reliance. So we're hoping that we will, on these first exploration missions, have some pick-and-eat foods. Right now, crew on orbit do get some fresh fruits on every resupply vehicle. So they'll get apples, oranges, things like that. They're not going to get any of that on a mission to Mars because we can't resupply. So growing plants is the only way that they're going to get any fresh produce. So we are hoping to have some of that ready for those missions. And then as we start validating these technologies and the reliability of these infrastructures, we can start making it more of the food system. So our end goal is to start just slowly decreasing dependence on prepackaged foods and increasing dependence on plant foods. But we don't ever want to introduce that risk of food scarcity. So we would always need to have some sort of surplus if we started relying more on having to grow plants. And then finally, I did mention automated food processing. So this could be something like a 3D printer. And several years ago, we had a small business innovative research grant from a small company in Austin who developed a 3D printer, and they showed that you could print different food components. So they showed you could print a cheese, you could print a sauce, you could print a dough as a proof of concept. And this kind of concept is very interesting for a couple of reasons. If you have a crew member on a long duration mission and they're just stop liking certain foods, and those foods were really high in certain nutrients, you could potentially help them by having a way to provide personalized nutrition. So you could have ingredients that have certain nutrients in them, and you could provide something customized for them through a 3D printer. And the 3D printer also just allows them to have something customized. So this would not be a whole food system solution, but it definitely could be part of a food system solution, a way that they could customize, a way that they could have some personalized nutrition. So finally, every food that we would expect to fly on station, on the International Space Station, or the lunar base, or future on Mars, we do quite a bit of testing on in our lab. We want to make sure that it's safe. We want to make sure that, that the sensory properties are where we want them to be, and that is through 5 years of shelf life. So we do quite a bit of testing in our own lab. However, we have recently also begun to do a lot more testing using closed chamber analogs. So NASA has a human exploration research analog on site, so you can see it on the right here. And we have tests going on. Right now they're about 4 a year, they're about 45 days. And we've done some testing in these in the past with food systems. So I'd mentioned using meal replacement, using a very dense nutrient bar. We tested that using 30-day HERA missions, so that was part of these missions that they have that are ongoing. They test a lot of science in these missions, so this was just part of that. And we did find that when you have this kind of closed system and when you try and limit it further, of course you're going to see worse impacts. And the crews that go into these missions are astronaut-like. They get selected from a subject pool of astronaut-like candidates, so they're highly educated, highly motivated people that have a lot of astronaut-like traits. So it does show they were eating less when they were getting these meal replacement bars every single day. Now, in a closed system, they tend to not eat their full amount of calories anyway. So anything that we can do to promote their food intake is very, very important. So this is not the best solution, is to provide something like a meal replacement. We also use these analogs, though, to see how better food systems can possibly support crew over time. Can we get the food system into a place where it better supports the crew? So we've recently completed a 45-day study where we were looking at adding a lot more functional foods to the diet, and can we see the health impacts in a closed system from that? And we're actually starting to do that on the International Space Station now. We're hoping within the next year or so that we will start even longer closed system missions that are more Mars realistic, because as I'd mentioned, we're probably going to have less of less on Mars than we have on the International Space Station. Less choice, less variety. Because the food gets sent ahead of the crew, it probably would get sent ahead of crew selection, which means whatever we send, this is what they have. And if you have one crew member who only wants to eat certain foods from that system, they're limiting it for their other crew members too, because we can't just send an overabundance of food. So that you could start creating nutritional deficiencies in everyone if people are only eating certain foods from that system. So our hope is that we can start working towards putting these real food systems that we expect we can provide on Mars into very long chamber studies and make sure that we can validate that how we set them up, how we design them, and how we implement them in these systems can support crew health and well-being over time. So that is what we're hoping to do. It gives you a much better idea if you put these systems into a realistic environment for long amounts of time on what the actual human health and performance outcomes are going to be. So that's the next step. So for key points, we're expecting that advances in prepackaged, bioregenerative, and automated foods will all be part of these missions. And there could actually be something out there that hasn't been identified yet. So we're always looking for new things, new technologies that could improve our systems. And then finally, food safety, nutrition, acceptability, and variety needs must be met for crew health and performance. So no matter what system we put into place, it has to be acceptable to crew, or they're not going to eat enough, maybe none of it. We must have enough variety so that they have some choice, they feel like they have some choice, and we definitely have to make sure it has all the nutrients, because if we miss even one, if at the end of 5 years one of them has completely degraded and gone, we could lose our crew. So we have to make sure that that's not going to happen. And so the work that I mentioned here, there's a lot of different groups working on it. So Dr. Scott Smith in nutritional biochemistry is one of the people that we work with very closely. We also have colleagues in microbiology, the J. Craig Venter Institute, combat feeding at NATIC, the military research institution. And then at Kennedy Space Center, they're working a lot on the plant growth systems. So that's VEGgie. And we work also with our immunologist, Dr. Brian Crucian, to try and make sure that the food systems we're providing can hopefully reduce some of that immune dysregulation that we see. And we also work with our logistics reduction team, who are trying to figure out a way to provide refrigeration for our food system on these long duration missions, but in a way that they can reduce the resource requirement for that. And we also have a lot of other groups that provide that have done work for us or provide solutions. NSPIRES is a grant application program that researchers can apply to when they put out grant calls in the food area. And we've had several groups work on grants in NSPIRES. SBIR is a small business innovative research grants I was talking about. So the 3D printer came out of that. And then finally, CAPS, the Center for Advanced Processing and Packaging Studies, is a group that we look to try and find solutions, new solutions. So with that, I will take any questions you might have.